Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that's something that you might want to stick around for, then I would love it if you could subscribe to this channel and make sure that you turn on the little notification bell so that YouTube will notify you every single time that I post. Also make sure that you are subscribed to our podcast channel. For those who aren't aware, I do a true crime podcast with Joshua Miles, Kirsty Sky and Dark Curiosities. We post monthly episodes about different true crime cases and you can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and many other places. And we also have a YouTube channel. I just realised I didn't even say the name of our podcast. It's Crime Time. If you type in Crime Time on YouTube, then you'll be able to find us, but I'll leave the channel linked down below anyway. And make sure when you subscribe to our podcast channel that you also subscribe to my fellow co-hosts of the podcast. They're also true crime YouTubers and they make incredible content and they're just lovely people. So I'll leave their channels linked down below as well. Anyway, in today's video, we are going to be talking about the case of 3-year-old Erica Green. Now, initially, this was actually a Jane Doe case. No one knew the identity of this victim for years, but eventually the truth about her background came to light, and so did the tragic circumstances surrounding her death. And I do just want to give a warning now because we are going to be talking about the murder of a toddler, and this case involves child abuse. So if you don't want to watch this video, I will leave another one in the iCard for you to watch instead. And having said all of that, let's just get into today's case. So this case took place in Kansas City in Missouri in the US. It was April the 28th, 2001, and that day a local man rang the police department because he was concerned about an elderly friend of his. It seemed as though his elderly friend had left his home and just wandered off, but he hadn't come back, and so this local man was obviously concerned and worried about his well-being. So he rang the police and just asked if they could come and look around the area for him, and they agreed. A couple of police officers began just looking around. In particular, they were searching around a wooded area, I believe, but shortly after their search began, they were informed that the elderly friend had been found safe and well. He was completely fine. So the search was obviously called off. It was over and the officers began walking back to their car, and as they were walking back they noticed something on the ground. It was the dead, naked body of a toddler. However, this body was headless. This toddler had been decapitated, and it didn't take long for this toddler's head to be found. Just a couple of days later, on the 1st of May, it was discovered in the wooded area not far from where the body was, and it had been wrapped in a plastic bag. So an autopsy was conducted and it determined that this was the body of a 3 to 4 year old African American girl. She had big brown eyes, her hair was in cornrows, and it was theorized that she had only been in the woods for about 3 to 4 days, but that wasn't the place that she died. So she died somewhere else and then her body was dumped in the woods. Now, I'm not sure how decomposed her body was when it was discovered. I don't believe it was too badly decomposed because when her body was taken for a post-mortem, the injuries that she had sustained were still very visible. She had injuries all over her body. It was very clear that she had been violently beaten. She had been punched, kicked. It's just horrible. This was a 3 or 4 year old girl that had clearly been murdered. And an object that was used to beat this little girl was actually an ashtray, and this ashtray was found near her body. The ashtray was tested for like fingerprints or DNA, but they couldn't actually pick any up. It seems as though they really lacked any forensic evidence in this case, and so for this reason investigators had to turn to the public to help them. One, find her killer or killers, and two, actually identify her. They had no idea who this little girl was or who her family were. Now, initially, in the beginning of this investigation, I think the detectives expected this case to be solved pretty quickly because obviously this was a toddler. You would expect that her family would have reported her missing straight away, because who doesn't realise when a child has vanished? They expected that a local child would be reported missing and then they would be able to identify this little girl as the missing child. However, no one ever came forward to report her as missing. And as a result, this unidentified toddler became known as Precious Doe. That was the name that was given to her during the time they were trying to find out her real name. Sketches were drawn of the girl, sculptures or busts of her head were made, as well as facial reconstructions, and they were all released to the public in the hopes that someone would recognise her and come forward. But it seemed that no one really did. Despite the fact that this case literally became national news, it gained so much interest and attention from the public. There were so many volunteers coming together to help with this case. They printed and handed out flyers and posters with Precious Doe's facial reconstruction on. They raised money for a reward fund, and this totaled to $33,000. Precious Doe's case was featured on several crime TV shows, including America's Most Wanted. Everyone, including investigators, were doing everything they could to try and identify this poor girl and give her her name back. But soon they had exhausted all of their leads and the case of Precious Doe just went completely cold. That was until the 30th of April 2005, over 4 years after the toddler's body was found, the police had a breakthrough in the case. That day, the police received a phone call from a man in Oklahoma, and he claimed that he was the grandfather of one of Precious Doe's killers. According to one source, this grandfather was named Thurman McIntosh, and he had a grandson named Harold Johnson, who at this point was 25 years old. And Harold Johnson had a wife, 30-year-old Michelle Johnson. Now, Michelle Johnson once had a daughter, and this daughter was soon identified as being the murdered toddler, Precious Doe. Her real name was actually Erica Michelle Marie Green, and she was 3 years old, just a couple of weeks away from her 4th birthday when her body was found in the woods. Harold's grandfather, Thurman McIntosh, said that when the news first broke that a toddler's body had been found in 2001, he had his suspicions that it was Erica, and he eventually confronted his grandson Harold, who was Erica's stepfather, about where she was and what happened to her, because she had just suddenly vanished. Thurman McIntosh was just so suspicious because Erica lived with her mother Michelle and her stepfather Harold, and she just suddenly vanished one day, and then not long after, the body of an African-American toddler was found in the woods. So he was immediately concerned and he confronted his grandson Harold about this. And eventually Harold confessed that that was Erica's body in the woods, that she was Precious Doe and that she had died in a tragic accident, although of course, as we know, her autopsy concluded that her death was far from accidental. She had been violently beaten. The grandfather kept his grandson's secret for about 4 years, but eventually in 2005, he decided to finally tell the police. I believe he was quite old, and he said that he just couldn't go to his grave with this secret. He told the detectives that he, quote, wanted people to know the truth about who Precious Doe was before he should die. One source states that Harold's grandfather, Thurman McIntosh, actually provided the police with a photograph of Erica before she died, and also a hair sample of her and her mother Michelle Johnson, although I'm not actually sure if that is true, because why would he just randomly have their hair samples? However, detectives were still convinced that McIntosh was definitely telling the truth, because apparently when he told the police, he knew details about Precious Doe's case that only the killers would have known. He knew information that hadn't been released to the public. What this information was, I don't know. But anyway, like I said, detectives thought that this was a very promising lead, and so they decided to question husband and wife Harold and Michelle Johnson, who were now the main suspects in Erica Green's murder. Now, at the time, both Harold and Michelle were actually already in custody and in jail in Oklahoma on charges unrelated to this crime. I don't know what these specific charges were. I know that they both had a criminal record. They'd both been to prison before. Michelle had convictions for theft and forgery, and her partner Harold had been convicted before for assault with a dangerous weapon and possessing a sawed-off shotgun. So whilst they were in custody on charges unrelated to this case, they were both questioned about the murder of Precious Doe. And eventually, in Michelle's questioning, she admitted that Precious Doe was in fact her 3-year-old daughter Erica Green, and that she was murdered by her husband, Erica's stepfather, Harold Johnson, and that together the two of them tried to cover it up. So Erica was actually one of 8 children, and Michelle gave birth to her on the 15th of May 1997. I don't know who Erica's biological father was, but she was actually born in prison. She was born whilst Michelle was in prison. Michelle met Harold Johnson when she was working as a sex worker, and Harold was, I believe, one of her regular customers. Eventually they started dating, and it was about a year after Erica's murder that they got married. In Michelle's confession to the detectives, she said that one late night in April of 2001, she was at home with her daughter Erica and her boyfriend Harold Johnson, and they lived in a house in Kansas City in Missouri. Anyway, that night Michelle had put her 3-year-old daughter Erica to bed as usual. However, at some point Erica actually got out of bed and she went into her mother's bedroom. Just like all young children do, when they can't sleep, they get out of their beds even though it's past their bedtimes, and they go to their parents' rooms. So Michelle told her daughter to go back to her bed, go back to sleep, and she listened and she did what her mother said. After this, Michelle went to have a bath, and when she got out of the bath, her boyfriend Harold said that Erica was misbehaving because she kept getting out of bed and she wasn't listening when he told her to stop. Now, Harold was actually drunk and high on drugs that night, as he was most of the time, I believe, and he was so angry that Erica wasn't doing what she was told. And so he went up to this 3-year-old and he literally kicked her in the head, and she collapsed and fell unconscious. And as we know, he also beat her with an ashtray that was found near her body in the woods. Michelle claims that when he did this, she just started screaming at him and saying, "What did you do? What did you do?" She also said that after he beat her, Erica's eyes just rolled back and she went limp. And so Michelle picked her up and she carried her to the bathroom and began splashing cold water in her face to try and wake her up, but it wasn't working. She wasn't regaining consciousness, and so Michelle picked her up once again and she placed her on the floor in their bedroom. And this next part actually enrages me. But both Harold and Michelle decided not to take Erica to the hospital or get her any medical treatment because at the time they both had warrants out for their arrest. They were both wanted by the police for some crime, I don't know what it was. But they both agreed not to take Erica to the hospital because otherwise they would be arrested and they'd both be sent back to jail. And they both couldn't risk that happening apparently, and so they just left her unconscious on the floor after she was severely beaten. Her mother decided to just leave her daughter, her 3-year-old daughter, to die because she didn't want to be arrested. And in her confession, Michelle admitted that this was a mutual decision. She wasn't forced into doing this by Harold. They both decided to just leave Erica on the floor and not take her to the hospital. And a medical expert later said that if they had taken Erica to the hospital as soon as it happened, there was a good chance that she could have been saved. She could have survived. But they both made the choice not to. And so 3-year-old Erica Green was left on the floor in their room unconscious for literally about 2 days. I think they expected her to wake up at some point naturally, but of course she didn't. Now, different sources say different things about this next bit, so I can't be sure which is correct. But some sources say that after about 2 days, Erica Green died on the bedroom floor. She stopped breathing, and so Harold and Michelle decided that they needed to dispose of the body. So they put Erica's body in her stroller and they took her to the woods where they removed her clothes. And apparently neither of them could explain why they decided to remove her clothes. Maybe it was because investigators could have identified her through them, or maybe it was for some other reason. But they removed her clothes, and then her stepfather Harold used hedge clippers to cut off her head. And this is where sources differ, because some state that Erica didn't actually die in their home and that she was still alive when they took her to the woods to dispose of her body. She was still breathing, but she was unconscious when they took her to the woods. And if that's true, then that means that she actually died when they decapitated her with the hedge clippers. But like I said, I can't be sure what is correct there because different sources said different things. Some said that she died on the bedroom floor after about 2 days, whereas others said that she was still alive but just unconscious when they decapitated her in the woods. After they decapitated Erica, they left her body in the woods and they wrapped her head in a plastic bag and put it in a trash can that belonged to the nearby church. However, they soon returned because they thought that it was just way too risky leaving it in the trash can in case someone from the church obviously found it and recognized Erica's face. And so they took her head out of the trash can and dumped it in the woods where it was later found. Following this, they just returned home and they acted like everything was normal after having just killed a toddler. The next day, a family member of theirs went to visit them, and obviously this family member noticed that Erica was gone, and so they asked where she was. And Michelle and Harold had prepared for the inevitable questions about Erica's whereabouts. They knew that people were going to ask where she was, and they had planned a cover story. And they told this family member that Erica had gone to live with a woman named Betty Brown, and that Betty Brown now had full custody of her. And this family member believed them because at one point Erica did actually live with a woman named Betty Brown. I think she was her foster parent because her mother Michelle was unable to look after her at the time. And as we know, they got away with it for 4 years. They got away with murder until Harold's grandfather, Thurman McIntosh, turned them in and they were arrested. Once they were arrested, Michelle's other children were placed in the care of family members or they were put into state custody. So both Harold Johnson and Michelle Johnson were brought to Missouri to face their charges there. Harold Johnson was charged with first-degree murder. However, he pled not guilty and so his case went to trial. Now, his partner, Michelle Johnson, actually agreed to take a plea deal. Michelle agreed to testify against her husband at his trial and plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a maximum 25-year sentence for her part in the death of her daughter. And so that's exactly what she did. She gave evidence against him and she was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Now, Harold Johnson actually confessed to the murder. He wasn't denying it. He wasn't denying his part. He wasn't denying that he was involved. But his defense team claimed that he shouldn't be found guilty of first-degree murder because it wasn't premeditated. They said that it wasn't planned. He never planned to murder Erica. He never planned to kill her. However, I believe Johnson's cousin, Lawanda Driscoll, actually gave evidence against him during the trial that discredits this. She said that Harold would often beat Erica if she didn't do what she was told, so he was violent towards her even before her death. Ultimately, he was found guilty on the 21st of November 2008, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. So he will remain in prison for the rest of his life. And that is the end of this case. That is the case of Erica Green. Such a sad case, and one that just makes me feel so angry. The fact that this 3-year-old could have been saved if they had just taken her to the hospital as soon as it happened, but that they chose not to because they were thinking of themselves is something that just can never be forgiven. She could have survived if they had gotten her some medical treatment, but instead they just left her unconscious on the floor. They left this 3-year-old girl to suffer because they didn't want to be arrested. It makes me so angry. I cannot even explain how angry it makes me feel. But yeah, that is the end of this case. As usual, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Also, my voice is breaking. Also, let me know of any other cases that you want to see me cover on this channel. Before I go, I just want to give a special shout out to the members of my Patreon page. Thank you so much for your support, guys. It honestly means the world. If anyone else wants to become a member of our little Patreon family, the link is always in the description box of my videos. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye guys.